Father, I respect and honor you. But why can't you let me live my life for once? It is my choice and I love her!
The Han River sparkled under the Seoul night lights. On the hill above the river stood a white mansion with 12 rooms, 3 cars in the garage and guards at the gate. This was the home of the Choi family. The father, Minister Choi, was one of the most powerful men in South Korea. His wife ran a chain of 5-star restaurants across the country. They had everything money could buy. But inside that big house something was broken. Their son Chung was 25 years old. Before his accident, he was the kind of rich kid every parent warned their daughter about. Fast cars, late nights, empty bottles. His father wanted him to learn the family business and help run the restaurants with his mother. But Chung did not want responsibility. He wanted parties. One night, after drinking too much at a club, Chung got behind the wheel of his car alone. He should have called a driver. He did not. The crash that followed changed his life forever. He survived, but his legs did not. The doctors told him he would never walk again. He was only 25. For months, Chung lay in his bed in that big empty mansion staring at the ceiling. The boy who used to laugh loudly and live wild was gone. In his place was a bitter man who hated himself, hated his friends, and hated anyone who tried to help him. Nurse after nurse came to take care of him. Nurse after nurse quit. He screamed at them. He threw things. He told them to leave him to die. His mother was desperate. She needed someone strong enough to stay. Far away in a small apartment in Seoul, a woman named Teresa was counting her last one. She was a Black American nurse who had moved to South Korea a few months earlier with her 4-year-old son, Caleb. Her mother had just died back home and the grief still sat heavy in her chest. She was a single mother now, far from everything she knew, trying to build a new life in a country where she barely spoke the language. When she saw the job posting for a live-in nurse at the Choi mansion, she did not hesitate. She needed the money. She needed a fresh start. At the interview, Chung's mother looked her up and down, then asked about her son. Teresa explained that Caleb was 4. And he had not started school yet since they arrived in Korea. Mrs. Choi agreed to hire her, but with conditions. The boy was not allowed in the main house. He was not allowed to make noise. He was not allowed to be seen. Teresa swallowed her pride and said yes. She needed this job more than she needed her dignity that day. From her first morning at the mansion, she felt the coldness in the air. Chung barely looked at her. When he did, his eyes were full of anger that had nowhere else to go. He snapped at her. He insulted her accent. He told her she would quit just like the others. Teresa said nothing back. She just did her job, changed his bandages, helped with his medication, and went back to her small room at night. She needed the money too badly to walk away. At night, after her shift ended, Teresa would sit on the edge of her small bed and write in a notebook. She wrote down what Chung ate, what medicine he took, and how his mood had been that day. It was part of her job, but it also helped her understand him better than anyone else in that house seemed to bother to. She noticed things, like how he only got truly angry when someone treated him like he was fragile. Like how he went quiet, not loud, on the days that were hardest for him. She never wrote any of this down for his mother. She kept it for herself. A small way of trying to understand the man behind the anger. Caleb, for his part, settled into their new life slowly. He missed his old apartment back in America sometimes, the small park near their building, the friends he barely remembered now. But Korea was becoming home in its own way. He liked the quiet garden behind the mansion, the koi pond near the back wall, the way the trees changed color when the season shifted. He was a curious boy who asked questions about everything. And being told to stay away from the main house only made him more curious about what was inside it. One quiet afternoon, while Teresa was busy with laundry, little Caleb wandered off. He found himself in a dim study room, and there, sitting alone in his wheelchair by the window, was Chung. The little boy, full of curiosity the way only a 4-year-old can be, walked right up to him. "Why are you sitting in that chair all the time?" Caleb asked. Chung opened his mouth to send the boy away. But something in those innocent eyes stopped him. Instead, he found himself answering. Caleb asked more questions. About the chair. About the big house. About why Chung never smiled. And slowly, without meaning to, Chung started talking back. For the first time in months, he had a real conversation that did not feel like a fight. This became their secret. Almost every day while Teresa worked, Caleb would sneak away to visit Chung. The two of them built a quiet friendship in that dim study room, hidden from everyone, including Teresa herself. Caleb would bring his small toy cars and line them up on the floor by Chung's wheelchair. Chung, who once would have snapped at any noise in his space, found himself laughing at the boy's made-up race commentary, his deep, serious voice imitating engine sounds. Some days, Caleb brought picture books and asked Chung to read them out loud, stumbling over hard words until Chung gently corrected him, never once making him feel small for not knowing. There was one afternoon, Caleb asked him why his room was always so dark, the curtains drawn tight against the sun. Chung told him he liked it that way. Caleb, without asking permission, walked straight to the window and pulled the curtains open, flooding the room with light. Chung opened his mouth to scold him, but the warmth of the sun on his face after months of darkness silenced him completely. From that day on, the curtains stayed open. One evening, while Teresa handed him his medicine, Chung asked a question that caught her off guard. "Where is your son's father?" Teresa froze. Her hand stopped halfway between the pill bottle and his palm. She quietly said he was not in the picture and left it at that. She wondered for days what made him ask. But Chung only said good night and sent her away like he always did. Still, something had shifted. He began to notice things about her. The way she never flinched at his anger. The way she never made him feel broken. Slowly, without either of them realizing it, he was falling for her. One afternoon, Mrs. Choi visited her son and found him laughing with little Caleb on the floor of the study. She froze in the doorway. This was the first time she had seen her son smile since the accident, 7 months earlier. Her anger melted into relief. She pulled Teresa aside before leaving and warned her to keep her son out of Chung's way so he would not be disturbed. That was the moment Teresa learned her son had been sneaking out of their room all along. That night, Teresa sat Caleb down and scolded him for never telling her about his escapades around the mansion. The little boy just shrugged and said Chung was his friend. The next day, Chung asked Teresa why Caleb was still not in school. She admitted she could not find an affordable one nearby, since they lived in such an expensive part of the city. Later that day, Chung told his driver to take her to a school close to the house to be enrolled, and Caleb himself paid the tuition out of his own pocket. Despite his parents being one of the school's grand benefactors, Teresa stood outside the school gates that day, watching her son walk in with a new backpack, and for the first time since her parents died, she let herself cry tears that were not all sad. Almost a year passed. Chung and Teresa grew closer with every season. One evening, while Chung helped Caleb with his homework at the kitchen table, the boy looked up and asked the question that would change everything. "Why don't you walk with your feet like everyone else?" Chung explained the way he always did, calm and simple. But then Caleb tilted his head and asked something nobody else had dared to ask in months. "If you can't walk like you, can you learn to walk like me? My mommy says I have baby steps and they're very small. I'm sure that won't be too much for you, Mr. Chung." Chung opened his mouth to say no, but the doctors were clear. It was impossible. But the words would not come out. That night he could not sleep. The question kept echoing in his head. The next morning he called his doctor and asked about physical therapy. Not because he believed it would work, but because a 4-year-old boy had looked at him as if giving up was not an option. He started his sessions the very next week and he told no one except Teresa. The first 7 weeks were brutal. His legs, weak from months of disuse, shook and gave out under him again and again. He fell more times than he could count, his pride bruised harder than his body. There were days he wanted to quit, days he sat on the therapy mat and told Teresa it was pointless, that the doctors had been right from the start. Each time she knelt beside him, helped him back up, and reminded him quietly that quitting was the only way to guarantee he would fail. She never pushed too hard. She never let him give up either. Slowly his legs grew stronger. First he could stand for a few seconds holding the parallel bars. Then he could take one shaky step. Within a few months he graduated from the bars to a walker, and not long after that. Every small victory he shared only with her, the two of them celebrating quietly in the privacy of the therapy room, because he was not ready yet for the rest of the world to know. By then the two of them had fallen completely in love. They would go for a walk in the park, Teresa pushing his wheelchair on quiet evenings, the two of them talking about everything and nothing, watching the sun go down over the Han River. She made him laugh again. She made him want to live again. Some 3 odd months into his therapy, something happened that even his doctors did not expect. He stood. He took one step. Then, with a cane gripped tight in his hand, Chung was walking again. He kept it a secret from everyone except Teresa, practicing in private, falling and getting back up again and again until his legs grew strong enough to trust. Then came the night of his father's political gala. Chung decided it was time. He invited Teresa as his date. When the doors of the grand hall opened, gasps rippled through the room. Chung walked in. Not in a wheelchair. Standing tall but leaning heavily on a cane, with Teresa at his side holding his other arm. His mother's hands flew to her mouth. His father stood frozen, his glass of wine forgotten in his hand. His younger sister Yuna stared in shock. And standing near the dessert table, his ex-girlfriend Sora nearly dropped her own glass. Chung walked straight to his parents and for the first time in years, bowed to them with real respect. His mother burst into tears of joy. His father, the powerful Minister Choi, could not speak. Everyone in that room could see it. This was not the same broken boy who left the world 7 months ago. But across the room, Sora's eyes were not full of joy. They were full of something colder. Something that would soon threaten everything Chung and Teresa had built. She remembered every birthday party, every family trip, every photo of her and Chung that his mother kept framed on the mansion walls. She remembered the ring he gave her in high school, the one she still kept in a small box in her drawer, even after they had broken up years before his accident. Watching him walk into that hall with another woman on his arm felt like watching her entire future get erased in front of 200 guests. She forced a smile for the cameras that night, but underneath it, something hard and determined had already begun to form. In the weeks after the gala, Sora would not let go. She had been raised to believe she belonged with Chung. Her father owned one of the biggest electronics companies in South Korea. Their families had practically promised the two of them to each other since they were teenagers. Now she watched the boy she once called hers walking into a future with someone else. A foreign nurse with a child that was not even his by blood. Sora called Chung again and again. She showed up at the mansion with gifts and old photos, trying to remind him of what they used to be. She reminded him of trips they took together as teenagers, of a promise ring he once gave her in high school, of the future their parents had always talked about over dinner tables. Every time Chung turned her away gently but firmly. He had moved on and nothing she said could change that. Sora was not used to losing. She had grown up the only daughter of a powerful businessman, given everything she wanted since birth. The idea that Chung, the boy she always assumed would be her husband one day, now belonged to someone else, a foreigner with no name, no fortune, and a child that was not even her own blood, was something her pride could not accept. When she realized she was losing, Sora changed her plan. She turned to Yuna, Chung's younger sister. Yuna was 2 years younger than Chung, but in many ways she was the opposite of him. While he partied, she studied the family business. While he ignored his parents, she worked beside them. She was sharp, ambitious, and the favorite child, the one their parents trusted with real responsibility. She and Sora had been close friends since childhood, and Sora knew exactly how to pull her in. "Just talk to him," Sora begged her one afternoon over coffee. "He still loves me. He just needs reminding." Yuna agreed to try, mostly to keep the peace in the family. She drove to her brother's house one evening, planning to gently bring up Sora's name. But what she found when she walked in stopped her in her tracks. Chung was sitting at the kitchen table, head bent close to little Caleb's, helping him sound out spelling words. Teresa was busy with fixing up his care needs. The whole scene looked like a real family. Warm, easy, happy. Yuna's stomach turned at the thought of her brother playing house with his African-American nurse. She had heard rumors about her brother and his nurse, Teresa, but seeing it with her own eyes was different. This was not some passing fling. He looked settled. He looked like he belonged there. She left without saying a word about Sora. That same night, Yuna called her parents and told them everything. She described what she saw. The boy at the table, the comfortable closeness, the way her brother looked at this American woman as if she were the center of his world. Minister Choi and his wife were stunned into silence. Their son, their only son, in love with his nurse. A Black American single mother. A woman with a child that was not even hers by blood as far as they understood it. The news hit the family like a storm. Mrs. Choi, who had cried tears of joy at the gala, now paced the floor of her bedroom, her mind spinning with worry about what people would say. Minister Choi, a man who had built his career on image and reputation, felt his blood run cold at the thought of his son's relationship becoming public. They tried to talk sense into Chung first. Gently at first, reminding him of duty, of family expectations, of the perfect match waiting for him in Sora. Chung listened politely and then told them clearly that his decision was made. He loved Teresa and nothing would change that. When gentle talk failed, the pressure grew harder. Mrs. Choi started inviting Sora to family dinners again, seating her beside Chung as if nothing had changed. Minister Choi began dropping hints in conversation about merging their family business with Sora's father's company, hints meant for Chung to hear. But Chung and Teresa held on tight to each other. Every dinner, every awkward family gathering, every cold comment from his mother, they faced it together. Teresa never raised her voice. She never fought back with anger. She simply kept showing up, kept loving Chung the way she always had, and that quiet strength only made Minister Choi more uneasy. At one particularly tense family dinner, Mrs. Choi made a sharp comment about how a real partner should understand Korean customs, how a real partner should come from a family that people recognize. Teresa set down her chopsticks calmly and replied that she understood the comment was not really about customs at all. The table went silent. Chung reached under the table and squeezed her hand, proud and a little nervous at the same time. Mrs. Choi said nothing more for the rest of the meal, but the look on her face stayed cold for days afterward. He could not break her with words, so he decided to look for something else. Minister Choi sat alone in his office one afternoon, turning a business card over in his fingers. A colleague had once recommended this man for a different matter years ago, a private investigator known for digging up things people wanted buried. Minister Choi told himself he was simply protecting his family, that any father would do the same. He picked up the phone and made the call. Minister Choi hired a private investigator, a quiet man who specialized in digging up secrets the rich did not want found. He wanted to know everything about Teresa. Where she really came from. Why did she really leave America? What she was hiding. It did not take long for the investigator to bring back a thick folder of information. Minister Choi sat alone in his study that night, reading every page by lamplight, his face growing darker with each line. What he read confirmed his worst suspicions. There were debts. There were secrets. And there was something about the boy Caleb that did not add up at all. He closed the folder, leaned back in his chair, and made a decision that would shatter his son's world. The folder on Minister Choi's desk told a story Teresa had never shared with anyone, not even Chung. Back in America, Teresa's mother had gotten very sick. The surgery she needed cost more money than Teresa had ever seen in her life. Without insurance to cover it, Teresa did something desperate. She borrowed money from a loan shark, over $150,000, just to give her mother a chance at survival. The surgery happened. But it was not enough. Her mother died anyway. And not long after, the grief was too much for her father's weak heart. He passed away too, leaving Teresa alone with a mountain of debt and a broken heart. But the debt was not the only secret. Caleb was not Teresa's biological son. He was her nephew, the child of her older sister who died during childbirth. The father was in prison with no way to care for a newborn. As the only living relative who could take him, Teresa was granted full custody. She raised him as her own from his very first day of life, loved him like her own, never once treating him as anything less than her son. She left America not just to escape her grief, but to escape the loan shark who would not stop calling, threatening, and demanding payment she did not have. South Korea was supposed to be a fresh start, a place far enough away to breathe and slowly pay off her debt while building a new life for her and Caleb. Minister Choi read every detail twice. To him, it did not matter that Teresa had taken the loan to save her mother's life. It did not matter that she had given up her own future to raise her sister's child. All he saw was debt, scandal, and a woman who was not good enough for his son. He thought about the headlines that could come from this. A minister's son, paralyzed in a drunken crash, is now in love with an indebted foreign nurse raising a child that was not her own. He pictured his rivals in parliament using it against him, his wife's restaurant chains losing customers over gossip, and Yuna's own future marriage prospects damaged by association. To him, this was not just about Chung's happiness. It was about everything his family had spent decades building. He decided to handle it himself quietly, the way he handled every problem that threatened the family name. One afternoon, while Chung was away at a physical therapy session, Minister Choi arranged to meet Teresa at a park near the mansion. She arrived thinking it was a simple walk to talk things over, hoping maybe his father was finally softening toward her. Instead, Minister Choi sat across from her on a bench and laid everything out. He knew about the debt. He knew about the loan shark. He knew everything. Then he placed a folded check on the bench between them. $3 million. Leave my son, he said quietly. Pay off your debt. Start over somewhere far from here. He will move on. He always does. Teresa stared at the check for a long moment, her chest tight, her throat burning with words she could not say. She thought about her debt still hanging over her like a shadow. She thought about Caleb's future, about school fees and security, and never having to worry about money again. And she thought about Chung, the man who had taught a 4-year-old how to do homework, who fought to walk again because a little boy believed he could. She picked up the check with shaking hands. She did not sleep that night. She sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the folded paper, running every possible future through her mind. If she stayed, the loan shark back home would eventually find a way to reach her, even across the ocean, and the danger would not just be hers anymore. It would touch Caleb too. If she left, she could finally close that chapter for good and give her nephew the safe, stable life she always promised herself she would give him. But every option meant losing Chung, and that thought alone made her chest ache in a way no debt ever had. That evening, before Chung even returned home, Teresa packed a small bag. She wrote him a short letter with the words, "I'm sorry I had to go." She left it on the kitchen table where he would find it. It said only this, "I'm sorry I had to leave." Then she took Caleb's hand and they were gone. When Chung walked into the empty house that night, calling her name, getting only silence in return, he found the letter on the table. He read it once, twice, a third time, as if reading it again would somehow change the words. The cane in his hand fell to the floor with a loud clatter, and for the first time since his accident, Chung felt like the ground beneath him had completely disappeared. That night he found the bottles his father kept locked in the study cabinet, the same cabinet where he and Caleb used to sit and talk in the dim light all those months ago. He broke the lock and drank until the room spun, until the pain in his chest dulled into something more bearable. The staff found him passed out on the study floor the next morning, and word quickly reached his parents. The weeks that followed were the darkest of Chung's life, darker even than the months right after his accident. He stopped going to therapy. He stopped leaving his room. The cane sat untouched in the corner where it had fallen that first night. He drank more than he should, bottle after bottle, trying to numb a pain that no amount of alcohol could touch. His legs, once growing stronger every day, began to weaken again from disuse and neglect. His mother tried everything. Soft words. Tears. Pleading. Chung barely answered her. His father tried too, standing in the doorway of his son's room, watching him stare blankly at the wall, and for the first time Minister Choi felt something he had not expected to feel. Guilt. He had wanted to protect his family's name. Instead, he had taken away the one thing that had brought his son back to life. He noticed something strange in his son's silence, too. Chung was not the angry, bitter man he used to be before Teresa. Even in his deepest sadness now, he was quiet, polite, and gentle with the staff. Teresa had changed something in him permanently, even in her absence. Minister Choi called his accountant one afternoon, almost as an afterthought, to confirm the $3 million check had been processed. The answer he got stopped him cold. The check had never been cashed. Not $1 of it had been touched. Teresa had taken it, but she had never used it. Minister Choi sat with that information for a long time, turning it over in his mind, slowly realizing what kind of woman he had pushed away. 2 months passed. Then 3. During those long months, the staff at the mansion learned to walk softly past Chung's door. The maids whispered to each other in the kitchen about how thin he had grown, how the food trays they left outside his room came back almost untouched. His old physical therapist called twice a week, leaving polite voicemails asking when he would like to resume sessions. Chung never called back. Yuna, his sister, tried visiting him once during that time. She sat by his bed and tried to talk about ordinary things, the weather, a show she had been watching, anything to coax a response out of him. He answered in short, flat sentences, his eyes never quite meeting hers. She left his room that day and cried in the hallway, finally understanding what their family had broken. Chung's 29th birthday arrived and his family insisted on a party, hoping it might pull him out of the darkness even a little. He agreed only because his mother begged him, but he walked into the party with no real hope in his chest. He still leaned on his cane, his steps slower and weaker than they had been months before. The party was full of guests, music, and forced smiles. Chung sat in a corner, barely speaking, barely eating, watching the celebration happen around him as if it belonged to someone else's life. Then the music stopped. A woman's voice came over the microphone, asking for everyone's attention for a birthday toast. Chung's head snapped up so fast he nearly knocked over his drink. Teresa stood at the front of the room, microphone in hand, looking right at him. Part 5. The room went silent. Every guest turned to look between Teresa at the microphone and Chung, frozen in his seat. His mother gasped softly. His father set down his glass, his eyes wide. Teresa's hands trembled slightly, but her voice stayed steady. She did not explain everything that night, not in front of the crowd. She simply wished Chung a happy birthday, told him she was glad to be back, and stepped down from the small stage. Chung stood up so fast his cane nearly slipped from his grip. She crossed the room in a few long, uneven steps, and he pulled her into his arms in front of everyone. The crowd erupted into applause, some guests wiping away tears they did not expect to shed at a birthday party. Later that night, away from the noise, Teresa finally explained everything to Chung. She didn't tell him about the check nor how she had taken it, but never spent a single dollar of it. She told him she had flown back to America, sold her late father's house, and used every cent to finally pay off the loan shark herself, free and clear, with no help from anyone. She had come back to Korea not because she needed his father's money, but because she could not stay away from the man she loved. She apologized for leaving without warning him, for the letter, for the silence. Chung held her face in his hands and told her there was nothing to forgive. He understood now what kind of pressure she had been under, and he respected her too much to be angry. Before dinner began, Minister Choi pulled Teresa aside on the balcony, away from the party. He asked her directly about the money, half expecting her to admit she had spent it after all. Instead, Teresa looked him in the eye and told him plainly that she never needed his money. She loved his son and was willing to never let Chung know about the check, but she was ready to fight for him, with or without his family's approval. She reached into her bag and placed the original check back into his hands, untouched, exactly as he had given it to her months before. Then she walked back inside, leaving him alone with his thoughts on the balcony. Dinner began soon after, the long table filled with family, guests, and quiet conversation. Teresa sat beside Chung, finally at peace. But across the table, Sora watched them with narrowed eyes, still unable to accept that she had lost. In the middle of the meal, Teresa happened to glance toward the head of the table where Minister Choi sat. Something was wrong. His face had gone pale, his hand clutching at his chest, his breathing suddenly shallow and strained. "He's having a heart attack," Teresa shouted, already moving. Chaos broke out around the table. Guests gasped and stood, some frozen in shock, others reaching for their phones. Sora fumbled to dial emergency services, her hands shaking. But Teresa did not wait. Years of nursing training kicked in instantly. She loosened his collar, checked his pulse, and began the steps to stabilize him right there on the dining room floor, calm and focused while everyone around her panicked. By the time the ambulance arrived, Minister Choi was breathing steadily again, his pulse weak but holding. The paramedics rushed him to the hospital, with the entire family following close behind, hearts pounding the whole ride there. In the hospital lobby, after the doctors finished their work, one of them pulled the family aside. He told them plainly that if Teresa had not acted as quickly as she did, Minister Choi would not have survived long enough for the ambulance to arrive. Her quick thinking had saved his life. Mrs. Choi turned to Teresa with tears in her eyes, all her old judgment melting away in that moment. She took Teresa's hands in hers and thanked her over and over, unable to find any other words. She thought back to the cold comment she had made at that family dinner months earlier, about customs and real partners, and felt ashamed of every word. When Minister Choi finally woke up in his hospital room, his family gathered around his bed, relief written across every face. But he asked for one thing before anything else. He wanted to speak with Teresa alone. The family stepped out, leaving the two of them in the quiet hospital room. Minister Choi looked at her for a long moment, the machines beside his bed beeping softly in the silence. "You saved my life," he said finally, his voice still weak. "And I tried to pay you to disappear from my son's life." Teresa said nothing, just waited. "I was wrong about you," he continued. "About everything. You never needed our money. You never wanted our name. You just loved my son even when he was broken, even when none of us could love him properly anymore." He reached for her hand. "You have my blessing. Both of you. I am sorry it took almost losing my life to see what was right in front of me." Teresa's eyes filled with tears as she squeezed his hand gently. Outside in the hallway, Chung stood pressed against the wall, having heard every word through the half-open door. When Teresa stepped out, he pulled her into his arms without a single word needed between them. A year later, Chung and Teresa stood together under a canopy of white flowers in the garden of the Choi family mansion, the same house where she once was not even allowed past the kitchen door. The koi pond Caleb used to play beside as a small boy sat just behind them, the late afternoon sun catching on the water. Staff who had watched the whole story unfold, the maids who once whispered about the angry young master, the driver who had taken Teresa and Caleb to enroll in school, all stood among the guests with quiet smiles. Mrs. Choi sat in the front row, dabbing happy tears from her eyes. Minister Choi, fully recovered, walked Teresa down the aisle himself. since her own father was no longer alive to do it. Even Yuna, who had once reported her brother's relationship to their parents out of worry, now stood as one of the bridesmaids, having long since become close with Teresa over the past year. And right beside Chung, dressed in a small suit far too big for him, stood Caleb holding the rings on a little pillow, the same curious boy whose simple question in a dim study room had given a broken man the courage to walk again and the courage to love. Chung, Teresa and Caleb became a family that day, bound not by blood but by something far stronger. A love that survived secrets, distance and every wall the world tried to build between them.